So that's it. Good. Well, at a plenary meeting we were talking about tectonic shifts, and the shifts take place even in our section. One of the speakers is missing, and thanks to Sasha Bondarenko, who joined our section, so we have more or less a section. So, protection of supply chain. Ploy wouldn't work. Any company, when it uses external content, works with external suppliers, vendors, uses external libraries, and becomes dependent on them. And in the recent months, from February 24, we had a number of attacks related to this factor, and we would like to discuss it now. We have a disparate team. I am from Solo. My colleagues Pavel Kulikov is from SDEC, Alexander Bondarenko from AirVision, and Roman Malitsyn from Astrolinux. So, a good team, actually. Suppliers, vendors, IT supplier. So we would like to answer many questions. The question is also diverse. We had different kinds of attacks, and I will address part of the questions to specific questions for their area of competence. But please interrupt us, quarrel, and each of us have his own opinion. So let's start from far away. Not about the supply chain. I recall the latest incidents about in-building content at web resources. After the plenary, I talked to the journalists who became victims of attacks. Usually they talk about attacks, but at the beginning of our special operation, at many media, we had headlines with inappropriate content. Then the same attack was directed at government agencies, and globally it turned into harsh recommendations from different regulators, including the Ministry of Digital Development. In your website, please don't use external content, because if the site is broken, you will have problems. So, what about reaction to such incidents in your companies, if any? For example, you have a large portal, a large resource, you are interested in external counters, external services. How did you react to this situation? So, external content. Yes. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes? Well. Yeah. Yes. We saw such attacks, external counters, external services that we installed in our site. We had two things. First, counters in an unauthorized zone without access to our internal logic, external services, and internal things that we developed ourselves. We developed our products on our own, historically, without external support. Express Courier version 3. All internal logic is ours. And we have our internal counters as well, in accordance with our internal matrices. So we didn't let anyone inside. That was the initial design. What about indexing? Yandex counters, Google counters, metrics that help the site to go digital. So you didn't have them. Initially we had them, But in certain zones, public zones, which are not related to our internal kitchen, the interface, external interface uses Google, Yandex. Now we reject Google, but Yandex is used, and with the help of Yandex, we build our heat maps.
Да, понятно. Саша, я хотел бы тебя спросить.
Alexander, it's your turn. You are from our vision, so security of our vision is your job as well. What is the situation for you? How did you react to such threats? Or is it not relevant to you as well?
Сложно счесть такую угрозу.
It's very difficult to call it irrelevant. As for the site, in our case, it wasn't critical. I don't remember any external products there. It's a purely informational resource which is separated from our internal enterprise infrastructure. Of course, if anything could happen, it wouldn't compromise our internal systems in any way. It's not exactly about supply chain, but from the very beginning of our operation, customers started getting phishing information, phishing letters, direct calls.
Если вы симпатизируете Украине,
if you sympathize with Ukraine, send us login and password, the rest we'll do ourselves.
Ну, в общем, все, что доступно, сообщите нам.
Just send us access codes, that's all. Yes, we got such letters. It's not about supply chain, it's about the attacks, about the general atmosphere. Before, we could disregard such actions because they are not feasible, because it can break the image and so on. Now everything can be possible.
Логика отметается, есть.
No logic, there is only politics, the desire
Просто есть, и люди
to do something bad, and people are ready to do anything. Now about supply chain, because
сейчас большая волна в open source.
we have a big wave of something which wasn't possible before. Some people may say, I do not allow certain countries to use my code, although it's open source. Some just insert certain elements in the code which can clean data or pop up banners in favor of a certain country. We have a lot of such things now. And the logic that we used before cannot be used now. Of course, for us, it's critical to protect our internal resources. But talking about supply chain, first of all, it's a question of mistrust in foreign software. So if that company can be hacked, it's impossible because it's a huge company and it's very difficult to hack. Now that company itself can hack us. The element in the supply chain is not trusted, sometimes malicious. And we had to insert additional control elements, control layers, control tiers to eliminate malicious codes in our infrastructure.
остается интегрированным между
The world still continues to be integrated. We use some open source components, and we wouldn't like to be absolutely
Мне кажется, что вот в таком ключе
inoperable and inacting and
много водителей
non-cooperating with anybody else. But we need more control elements
по-другому смотреть.
and look at our relations in a different way.
Да, понятно. Ну, тематика,
I see.
на мой взгляд, близка к нашей повестке.
Open source is close to our subject.
У всех есть какой-то кусок.
I think you also have such cases. Roman, Astra-Linux uses community codes. What is your reaction to this situation? What about your operating system? Yes, I can only agree that this is our problem. The problem of supply chain protection is very important for us because we use a lot of open source codes in our operating system. We try to use the protected operating system, which can be installed in government agencies, and those agencies are attack targets, lucrative targets. And we cannot just control everything and say it's all right, you can use it indefinitely. No, it's a multi-layered issue. We have technological code control tools. And when we certify for the first level of trust, we use all the modern phase testing, static testing, dynamic testing tools, all the modern advanced code control tools are used in our company. And we try to use something new, statistical analysis of the code. This is first layer. We have the trust stand, trust base. We check codes. We ask third parties to check our codes as well, especially for the critical elements. Second is the integrity control tools in the operating system, which help us to control integrity of the code and the replacement of applications with malicious codes during the functioning, during the operation of our software. So we have different integrity control tools, dynamic integrity control, when all our software in binary codes is isolated from external world and is signed with electronic signature. And the module, when the software is launched, checks the correction of the electronic picture to avoid replacement. And all the software, file-based, binary-based, is signed with electronic signature. And our partners who develop software is also receive our key pairs with our key management infrastructure, and they sign their products, and we build an enclosed development environment. But we understand that in some situations, as you said at the beginning of the discussion, that some changes might take place in a certain piece of the code at some website that we can miss. So we have one more subsystem of integrity control, mandatory control, which divides all the software into several layers of integrity, levels of trust, as we call them. They are absolutely isolated one from the other. We have the system component, which is key, the kernel,
система инициализации.
the initialization system for the web server.
Если какой-то
And even if some malicious software will reach the web server, it cannot affect system software because those tiers are divided
мы эту историю развиваем дальше, теперь
and independent of each other. We moved on and developed the sandbox mechanism for our software.
использовать
We made it possible to use Docker containers at some integrity levels. System administrators can launch software in some isolated
определенные
layers if they doubt, if they cannot trust certain codes to check its integrity. Why do I say that? Because trust in supply chain is very important, and one-time checking is not sufficient. It should be multi-layered, it should be multifaceted, signatures, division of binary layers into layers of trust,
все возможные другие механизмы.
and many other mechanisms. For example, building trusted development environment with partners. Thank you. Can you comment what do you do in this deck?
Вы на это, собственно, реагировали у себя.
What did you do?
Ну, собственно, у нас,
Well,
говорю ранее,
as I said before,
свой продукт.
we have our own local product that we have been developing historically on our own. We didn't have any external developers. We did the job ourselves. We used some outsourced components. Yes, we used them. And there is an important point here that after
Скрипт, который
renewal of the repository of the package, we launch a certain script to check all kind of new trigger words and so on. So we have to check and monitor.
скрипты для проекта.
We have to write the scripts to check the script texts, double check, if you like.
Вот. То, что было сказано ранее по поводу
As for the
автоматизированной,
automated and non-automated checks, yes, they are also important. I can say that for
компаний,
developers,
наступает, скажем так,
we have the golden era when you can come and say that I need this because this can stop, eliminate reputation risks for the company. Because if you don't do that, you can
тебе нужен
lose reputation. In order to avoid this, you need 1, 2, 3, 4. If you cannot buy it, you go to services, to developers.
например, очень
Now,
сместился акцент
we changed the focus very much in favor of security. We had it before, but now it's much greater.
но то, что на нас
Now we have additional responsibility for everything that is released.
компании
If you take, for example,
не нас, да,
other developers,
раньше копился так
before
техдолг
there was the kind of technical debt.
динамической проверки.
At a certain level, there were some potential
Были
probable vulnerabilities, but nevertheless, let us release the product and then later on we shall close the gaps. Now, the technical debt is not relevant at all. Business wants to avoid compromises, loss of reputation at all. So it's an interesting time for us. As for languages
скажем, применяемых технологий,
and technologies,
то здесь тоже, как мне кажется,
I think
у российских
Russian engineers
есть 100%
have 100% probability of building their own programming language. that would be nice and secure. But this is just an opportunity for our Russian developers.
То есть, если тебя вот послушать, получается,
If I got you right, so application security
долгое время очень активно
that was actively discussed by security people now is in the trend, and it's becoming a business function, actually, almost. Yes, look, I would divide
на две части.
it into two parts. Part one is something that was needed really,
Так, часть вторая,
and secondly,
весь тот
it's all the marketing materials that created the requirement, that
партнеры на территории,
stimulated the requirement, because there were some
потому что вот
partners said you need SDLC. Why? Because you have this and that. We see such a trend. It goes from here into that area, and often that was also important, and decision makers also
какие-то части,
agreed without going into detail. If they say, then this is it makes sense. It's the worldwide trend. Let us spend some money on that resource. Now, the requirement is much higher, and we can do it. We can make it part of the business function.
мне кажется,
But as I believe, the situation is that security, data security of the final product
действительно
is really
конкурентным преимуществом.
a competitive edge.
Да, понял, спасибо.
Yes, I got you. Good.
У меня, знаете, предложение тематики.
You know, I have an idea to continue with the open source
Наверное,
theme, talking about apocalypse. Over the past few years, the world has been surprising us all the time. Pavel and I discussed that. See, the new reality has arrived. I got inserted in it. I got used to it. And then just tomorrow, something turns around again, and I'm surprised again. So we have just been talking about each company using open source one way or the other, and trying to keep under control what's supplied from open source. Now the day has arrived that open source is supplying what we don't need. Open source libraries
российское передрисование
by default. When Russian facilities
для нас, как для компании,
start generating something inadmissible for our companies, for our customers. Your response.
внутри компании,
Do you have any crisis plan in your company? What do you propose to do?
у кого по этому поводу?
Well, in random order, who has anything to say? Alexander, maybe you can start.
Если мы все-таки посмотрим,
Well, if we take a look at what open source is, it's open source code in the first place. And in this sense, I believe that
произошли
regardless of all these things that have happened recently, so that projects are seeing inbuilt unfriendly scripts, something else, but nevertheless, this code is open.
просто
And stories like that happened before, maybe not to that scale, but more
больше там.
in a more utilitarian way.
Раньше
So now the logic is mostly about political activism. But in the past, I myself saw news that in some open source project got a thing built in that would mine cryptocurrency or organize DDoS attacks and something like that. That used to exist in the past as well, but with a different purpose and to a smaller scale. And it was just normal to see some project that would stop being maintained, that would be intercepted by the people who would start building some bad things in it. But then open source is about having the source code open, and it's a trend. And I'm not really prepared to articulate that, but it's a question of trust.
будут
And I think people are looking at that in the world as well. And I think that the companies that are going to show this openness, when they're prepared to show this source code, how many cases we can remember that foreign vendor would not pass the source code to FSB for certification. I think in the future, the very content of the code will not be as valuable because the vendor company only has value if it's able to deliver software features and services, and not because their programmers have managed to, code some feature. So therefore, the companies that will be ready to have the source code open, they will enjoy better trust from customers, even though open source has got smeared a bit now. But it can be controlled. I can open the code. I can run some automatic tests, or even visually I can see what's happening in this code. And then I can maintain it myself. But that depends on the license, of course, because that would be a fork. If it's a closed code,
Гораздо сложнее. Можно, но гораздо сложнее.
binaries are not arriving, it becomes much more difficult to analyze it.
Про supply chain.
Regarding the supply chain and the source code, I recall a situation, I think it happened like 5 years ago, and it was about the following. An employee in a company has written an open source library, attached a license to it. I think it was GPL3. And the remark was quite funny there, that it is open source, but if this library is going to be used in a piece of software for distribution in the US, the author of this library should receive 1.5 or 2% of the company revenue. And here, there's a question of licensing cleanness, so it's not enough to run through the source code. You can also be caught on some licensing condition. This calls back the statement that there are projects that says it can't be used in Russian Federation. That's the first case. And the second case is regarding what you, Vladimir, are saying. So everybody has ever worked with NPM packets know that. It looks like open source. It seems like clear. There's a line there, and you invoke it, certain actions happen, and there are no cases where miners, for instance, using the package would download some network sniffers as well. So this also has to be looked at. So it's also open source, but the question is where it connects and how much you can trust it. And finally, because we're a country that is present all over the world, nobody stands in the way for a malefactor to lease some space in a Russian data center and make it so that this particular library, this particular package, should call the same data center that services the infrastructure of the company itself. And then it's about joint effort from the developers and network activity and forensic studies. So once again, we are forced from one place to grow information security of everything. Yes, got you, Roman. I think your story is the most acute. I'm sure you've assessed those risks. Yes, of course, we've assessed these risks. But I'd like to mention separately that even though this story was happening, so malicious software was inserted into the open source component, but as it was rightly mentioned, it was a blow to the reputation of the open source movement. And the open source movement felt this blow and understood its importance, because if they were to allow this to happen looking forward, the whole reputation of the open source movement would be damaged. So if you take a look at the statements of the open source community, it's acutely negative. They try to go away from political mottos, slogans, and focus on the code. On the other hand, a question was asked, how prepared are we? I would say we are perhaps prepared a little bit more than other developers of the operating systems, because historically we in Astra, Linus Astra, wrote quite a lot of code from scratch. So the entire set of information protection tools, the graphical environment, administrative utilities have been written from the ground up. So we have built an infrastructure of our own development. We are perhaps one of the few who do the operating system UX. We have a lot of mobile apps, UXers who do websites and mobile apps, but those who do the UX for operating systems, they absolutely inexistent in this country. But we do that. It's clear that not all the code has been written by ourselves. Most of the code has been borrowed from open source. But this said, we understand how to maintain the development of our own operating systems. And we believe that these risks are there. They're not yet important enough, but we'll try to build up the headcount of our own developers in these conditions. Okay, clear. But if the risks does come, so I've heard that we are going to keep developing ourselves, but then it's a huge size, scope. Well, it's about a considerable slowing down of the development pace. If we accept this risk as possible, as feasible, complete mistrust to the open source, then everybody starts developing everything on their own, the speed of development goes down, and we keep using the old, well, tried and tested software. And so for us, for instance, the question of expanding our repository also requires a certain balance at decision-making. If we add some million packages, are we prepared to maintain these million packages? Adding a package to a repository is not a problem, but it's just like an ant hive in a forest. They brought a lot of twigs there, and so it's there, but what's happening inside, you don't know. So for us, when we're talking about server platform, we are actually facing a choice what to do. Either build a server platform where everything would be accessible, or to build a trusted and stable server platform where a certain number of components will be trusted and tested out. And we're always at this balance between capabilities to maintain, to develop, and the market needs. It's a difficult story, actually. Okay, got it. I just wanted to shift the direction in a different direction. So it's a humongous task, and indeed we see three approaches. What Roman says, that slowing down the development pace within the company. Second, some commercial collapse or collaboration where several companies join their efforts to replace some open source code, and discussing with the Ministry of Digital Development to form some local community. So which of the three routes looks safer and better and more effective? And perhaps, Pavel, it's a question to you. How, according to you, if this is a commercial initiative, will you be prepared as a company to consume commercial Russian open source? Well, you know, it doesn't sound like a swear word, I mean, Russian open source. There are quite a lot of companies who are contributors to open source projects. You take Solab. I think it all depends on the goal, on the purpose. Because what Roman has been talking about, if we're talking about an operating system, and Alexander talked about that earlier, showing an example of implementing, of the realization of a threat, where someone was storing a project on GitHub, then the domain has been purchased by someone else, and so links and feedback started to get through this. This vector of attack is probably for those who make operating systems for use in defense, in government. For them, this would be a critical vector. In this case, they will indeed have to watch the contributors and those who are writing anything for this open source project. Yes, here is a separate headache. I just started to think about it, and there are lots of problems. If it's about a commercial project, well, perhaps it's a question of weighted risk and criticality. Because if in some commercial product a library is to be used that works with user data and you don't know anything about this library, then it's your risk. And perhaps you have to understand this risk, or you write yourself. So I think that the Russian open source community will exist in any event. That's the first thing. And second, this whole story is going to end sooner or later. So I think that one way or the other, people will find contact points. And developers are a very alive, thriving, the community, developer community is a thriving organism, and they will find points of contact. If there's going to be some specific Russian branch of that community, well, let it be. I don't see anything bad about it. I will put it this way. As far as open source is concerned, I would not support erecting barriers between countries. But when we talk about commercial companies, actually, I would like to draw the line here. Because the general attitude is that open source is free software. No. The software can be quite commercial, but the source code would be open. So, talking about open source software, one of the ideas that's mentioned as a foundational one for this approach is that if the code is open, then a lot of eyes look at it. And so putting something there that people would notice is much more difficult. And partly what's happening now confirms this, because all these stories with code injection get to be known because people come to find these things. So, as far as barriers are concerned, so that you should need Russian open source different from the worldwide, I don't think we should exclude ourselves from the worldwide open source movement. But if the company is using such projects, then of course there'll be more attention to SDLC. I think the attention to the control of third-party code, security control should become much more important. But again, putting barriers at the open source level, I think that would be a wrong thing to do. Thank you. Roman, can I have a say as well? Actually, the idea of bringing all the developers into a single distribution, I think it's quite utopian. It's just like, let's bring together all the AV developers to bring a good AV product. I would just like to add one thing to this whole discussion. We have been talking about hazards or for supply chains during the military operation, but actually it's a very specific problem, and there's a worldwide problem to maintain supply chain. And Google and Microsoft have a project now to look for key projects, their automatic verification. You can look it up.
Действительно, встает вопрос
And indeed, there's a question that comes about identifying key components on which a whole range of technologies depend, so that these key components should be paid more serious and higher attention. Because we've indeed looked at this project. This project deserves serious attention. There's a formula to assess the criticality, for instance, as part of this project. There are automated scripts that check a lot of GitHub repositories to remove the vulnerabilities timely and other things. So I think the problem of attacking supply chains is common for the entire world. And second, that you need to make efforts worldwide, on a worldwide scale, and verification of such repositories, identification and ranking of key technologies that we all depend on.
действительно эта проблема.
Indeed, it's a worldwide problem. I wouldn't just restrict myself to the Russian borders. Well, thank you. Well, optimism for three companies in a row that the open source will regulate and help us to go away from such politically motivated cases. I'm happy to hear that. So if the picture is, well, looks just like this, it's good news. But real life may be quite different, and we'll see what the regulations will look. Wrapping up and going back to the theme of classical supply chain, I would like to ask about the internal philosophy. I won't hide. For me, we see the topic of supply chain, we've been seeing it for quite a long time. And so we have watched what's been happening there. We've noticed that it's been growing year on year in a more classic approach where IT outsourcers and code developers were dealing with the supply chain, not extending it to the entire community. So it looks like this makes a lot of sense. So not to trust anything that comes from the outside. So it's dangerous. How does it look for all three of you involved in the cybersecurity theme? Have you started to trust less to foreign developers or external developers? Or maybe nothing has changed, you just formally put up the controls. Or, as Pavel rightly said, it is just going to go away someday and life is generally the same. Roman, I suggest we start with you. Well, I'll give a brief answer. For us, the problem of trust to the software that we haven't built ourselves has always existed. We now increase the number of verification efforts and checks, and but we've seen this thing for quite a long time. So globally, nothing has changed for us. We just allocated additional resources to perform activities that we have been doing all the time. I'll give a brief answer. On the whole, in the moment, there is indeed a certain trust crisis, and we, on our part, have also introduced certain activities as part of the development process, and also in terms of using the resources that we have. We have never been big proponents of cloud services, even though we have consumed something in our model. And naturally, quite a serious risk arose of this just being shut down. And now we have certain long-term activities aimed at making the company more autonomous. And a lot of companies are doing exactly the same thing. It's quite natural. Looking forward, everything will develop on the way the situation plays out. I'm sure that the power of the humankind as a whole, however pathetic it might seem to you, is in collaboration, in working together. And I'd like to believe that this is a moment like this, and it's not going to lead to a global fragmentation of the world and to a global crisis of trust. I wouldn't like it all to lead there. Well, but so far, the motion is going that way, and the companies, including our own, proceed to reduce the level of trust to the vendors.
Хороший вопрос.
A good question.
Ну, просто не только IT-часть.
And it's not, we're not just an IT function. We're also a logistical company. Our supply chain is about logistics worldwide. So you mean the real shipments, real deliveries, rather than software shipments? Yeah, people joke in our company, we love containers because we love boxes. I think
Он обостряет.
any crisis puts it all on relationships. Let me just philosophize. So all this arrogance goes away, and
Самое честное.
so only the most honest ones stay.
Кажется, здесь
So I think
взаимодействие
as in the interaction with some suppliers,
выстраивается момент.
well, the first thing that should be instilled is trust. So how long are you going to work with us? Are you sure it makes sense for us to work with you? Are you not going to leave? And for those companies that that have left and are going to come back, the question for them is, next time, are you going to leave again? How are you going to confirm that? And that refers to both large players and small ones. It applies to both infrastructure and software. So the question is about integrity. It's a question about honesty and trust. Okay, I think we're wrapping up on a positive note. All the speakers and participants in the round table believe that the world is not going to change in principle. It will all go away, and we'll just move to a better relationship, and we should bring our anxiety level down. But nevertheless, the supply chain is an important thing. Everybody is thinking about how to protect it, and we'll be looking ways to do that. With this, I'm wrapping up our meeting. Thank you for all the attendees and to the speakers. Alexander, that you've got involved on a short notice. Separate thank you to you. Okay, thanks. Bye.